Hello, welcome to From Billabong to London, which Mary Grant Bruce wrote and published in 1915. I'm just adding a little bit at the front because I realised I just sort of burst into it, assuming that everybody would already have the background details. I think what's important to know about this novel is it's the first of Bruce's books where they're off fighting in World War One. It was written during World War One, so she did not know how it was going to turn out. And she based quite a bit of it on her own experiences of being married to a soldier who went from Australia to the UK to serve, and so there's a lot of authentic detail in the book. And I also thought I'd add that, like all of Mary Grant Bruce's works, the charming aspect of, or one of the charming aspects of the novel is that she's great at adventure, and the other is the characters just have lovely banter with each other. It's just delightful to read. There's a part in this one where Wally's asking for a quenching lemonade. He's just a little quench, he says. I just love the way they play with language. So this is just a little overview because I realised I just leapt into it. So now, straight into it. Today I'll be talking about From Billabong to London. This is my copy from the 1950s, still with its cover. It was published in 1915. Mary Grant Bruce didn't know when she started writing it that the whole Anzac Day landing at Gallipoli would happen. So she diverted the whole Billabong quartet to London. So they're not, in the strict sense of the word, Anzacs. Right, this is one of my favourites, so I can't wait to talk to you about it. What happens in From Billabong to London? It starts, obviously, at Billabong. It's a wintry afternoon, quite grim weather. Jim returns to the household and is telling his father that he feels a bit despondent and he thinks he has to join the war. Mr. Linton says yes, unfortunately he has to agree. But Mr. Linton suggests that rather than joining the Australian troops, Jim should join up in England. And this is because Mr. Linton conveniently has to go back to what they call home, back home to deal with some property that has been left by his uncle. And he decides he's going to take Nora with him. So it's going to be all of them going. Just as they decide this, Nora and Wally walk in, and Nora's like, oh great, we're going. And Wally realises that he could also go with them, and this would solve his problem of being slightly underage to join the Australian troops, but they are taking younger people as officers in the UK, so he can join up over there. So they make it a group trip, or at least they decide that that's what they're going to do, as long as Wally's guardians / brothers are okay with it. So then there's a few, I guess you'd call them domestic interludes. Nora rescues a wallaby and nurses it back to health, and they all go out and they pull a bullock that's stuck in the mud out of the mud. Meanwhile, they're with great difficulty arranging transport to England, because every time they get booked, it gets turned into a troop ship, so they can't go on that one. And eventually they manage to get onto a liner that's heading to the UK. Along the way, Nora spots a mysterious light at night that is signalling for German submarines, and they catch a German spy, so very exciting. They stop in Durban, and the boys get mugged, and then they catch the muggers. They get back into the ship, and then it gets captured by German submarines, and by a German submarine, and it's about to be sunk, and it's not, because then it's rescued by a British, dreadnought. So they all survive. They arrive in the UK, where they find it very unlike Billabong. There's no verandas, everything's grey, the trees have no leaves, it's all very, very strange and disappointing, I think. Nora, very uncharacteristically, gets pneumonia, and they're all feeling a bit down in the dumps when in the last chapter the boys arrive back in their uniforms because they have been accepted into the army, and they all realise that that's the most important thing, that saving the Empire is what they're there to do. So that's a quick summary. We're talking about their rescues. All right, obviously there's a few small rescues, like the wallaby nursed back to health and the bullock rescued from the mud. The major rescues are obviously the German submarine that the German spy that they capture, the German spy that they capture, and the Empire that the boys come to the rescue of. So that's what the whole novel is really about. Sacrifice for the Empire, and doing this on Anzac Day, so that's quite appropriate because this is a novel that was written in the course of World War One, so it's clearly very pro the war, pro the Union, pro coming in and helping Mother England, and it's very appropriate to be recording this on Anzac Day. Okay, I'd like to point out how much From Billabong to London is based on Mary Grant Bruce's own experiences. She had made a trip to the UK in 1913, and she had met her second cousin, George Bruce, whom she had married. And he had been he was in the British Army, and he sort of retired, I guess, and they immigrated to Australia. But then, of course, World War One broke out, and he was immediately recalled. So they then returned to the UK in a ship called the Nestor, rather than the Perseus that the Lintons travel in. But essentially it was the same trip. There were 30 passengers rattling around in a ship that was made for 300. They had blackout conditions. They stopped in Durban. Obviously, they did not encounter a German submarine, but apart from that, bit of excitement, it was essentially the same journey. And she continued to call on her experiences when she got to the UK, because she has very wisely decided to base the Lintons in England, and she and her husband were based in Ireland, and she has them go to Ireland in the next book in the series, in the series, and also in this, there's almost like a trilogy of war books. There's From Billabong to London, then Captain Jim, and then then Jim and Wally, then Captain Jim, and then they go back to Billabong. As is typical of Bruce, there's a veneer of anti-intellectualism, but she actually uses a lot of allusions and assumes that there's shared cultural capital with her readers. And Wally, of course, is, as always, the most intellectual of the group. So at one point, they're having a discussion on the boat about how difficult it is to imagine what it will be like when they arrive at the other end. And Wally says, "Of course, one knows it's going to end and that something altogether different is going to happen, only one can't picture it. It's like being told you'll die someday. You know it's perfectly true, but you don't believe it." "Wally," ejaculated Nora, amazed. "What on earth is the matter with you? Are you sick?" "Sick?" asked Wally, staring. "Not me. I was merely reflecting. Can't a fellow think?" "It's so unusual in your case," put in Jim. Right, so on one level, thinking and reflecting is being mocked. But then there are an awful lot of allusions that are made by the narrator, so by Bruce herself. So when they're sleuthing for the mystery person who's signalling to the enemy, they are compared to Sherlock Holmes. And I thought, they're just a little bit too early for Poirot. He's post-World War One. And the officers think that they're, making it up or imagining it, and they're accused of reading too many penny dreadfuls. Right, and there's also point where the narrator says, oh, yes, they came to see the beauty and the mystery of ships, which is from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's My Lost Youth, 1845, which is a lyrical poem about wanting to return to an ideal past, the place in the seaside town where he was brought up. And I'm going to go into this in a bit of detail, because the quote comes from a stanza that reads, I remember the black wharves and the ships and the seasides tossing free, the Spanish sailors with bearded lips and the beauty and mystery of ships. And the magic of the sea and the voice of the wayward song is singing and saying still, a boy's will is the wind's will and thoughts of youth are long, long thoughts. But there's also this rather grim following stanza. I remember the sea fight far away, how it thundered over the tide, and the dead captains as they lay in their graves overlooking the tranquil bay, where they died in battle. Where they in battle died, And the sound of that mournful song goes through me with a thrill. A boy's will is the wind's will, and the thoughts of youth, the long, long thoughts. And I'd also note, so it's a bit of a reference to the war that they're going into. I'd also note that the ship they're on is called the Perseus, named after the son of Zeus who slew Medusa. So there's another warrior link. Now, as usual, most of the references made by characters are from Wally, who seems to read a lot more than the rest. When they arrive in Africa, Wally quotes walking together holding each other's tails, which is from a children's poem about elephants, about elephant walking along the trails are holding hands by holding tails. I think that's really quite sweet. And he also references Scipio, the Roman general who conquered parts of Africa, and King Solomon's Mine, the 1885 novel by Rider Haggard. So, as you can see, Bruce is actually part of, she's referencing contemporary literature. She's using it to effect in her novels, and I'm going to just quickly talk about how that is an ongoing thing, and Bruce herself is referenced by later authors. Aye, the chapter where they rescue the bogged bullock is interesting to me because it reminds me of the only other description of rescuing a bogged bullock I've ever read, which is in one of the Tomorrow When the War Began series by John Marsden. And that is fascinating because John Marsden himself acknowledges Mary Grant Bruce as one of his is a great influence on him. And indeed, the main character of his series, Tomorrow When the War Began, which was written in the 1990s, early 2000s, is Ellie Linton, who lives on a farm station in either New South Wales or Victoria, it's hard to tell, and who has... she's an only child, she's very close to her father, her mother stays mostly in the kitchen, so she's more of a housekeeper, brownie, kitchen figure. And she has a neighbour called Homer, who's a big, reliable elder brother figure. And she is very competent, practical, and has kind of adventures in the bush, I guess you'd say. Right. And of course, they're fighting a war. In Bruce's case, they go to fight in World War I overseas, and in Marsden's case, Australia is invaded and they are protecting their homeland. It's pretty easy to see the link between Bruce's adventure stories and Marsden's adventure stories. So, an overview. I really like this one. I think it's a strong Bruce. And it's obvious when you read it that it is... it continues to echo through the chain of literature in Australia, I think, because Marsden is so clearly heavily influenced by Bruce that the impact of this story is continuing to this day, which is something that's lovely to see. So yes, I would highly recommend